I chose to study a student who I will call Owen for my ethnography. Like many American students, Owen's cultural identity is one with many layers. Owen primarily considers himself to be French, though he was actually born in America. Owen's parents are both Senegalese. They immigrated to France toward the end of the 20th century, then spent a little time in America right before and after Owen was born, before returning with the entire family to France to raise him there. Sometime after returning to France, Owen's parents separated, and he was raised mainly by his mother, who works in a hospital as some type of healthcare professional. He was raised in a relatively big town, and when he reached middle school, he went off to boarding school in a very small French town. After a couple years at boarding school, Owen started to have trouble. He did not disclose the nature of this trouble to me, but it was serious enough that his parents gave him a choice. For high school, he could go live with family members in Senegal or in America. He chose America. He came here as a 14-year-old and is now 17. I was his math teacher his freshman year, so I have known him since the day he started school here. Here are some of the questions I asked Owen when I sat down with him last week. Here are a few more. And here are the ones that I asked his uncle. I categorized my interview results into 3 categories: family life, academics, and culture. Here's my takeaway from his family life. One of the main results is that I have a better understanding of his socioeconomic experiences, both here and in France. The fact that he went to boarding school in France leads me to believe that his family is middle class, his parents are middle class. Boarding school is not as expensive in France as it is in America, but it is still indicative of a middle class upbringing at least. Additionally, his parents are so well-traveled that they must be middle class to afford it. Owen has been able to travel back to France for each of the 2 summers since his arrival to the U.S. This is a privilege that few of my immigrant students have. Owen's mom visited him during December of his 2nd year in the U.S. He was thrilled to show her around his neighborhood and his school, and he introduced her to me for a few minutes. She was unable to communicate in English, but I could tell from her demeanor that she was thrilled to be there with her son. Over a year and a half ago, Owen's mom was offered a position at a hospital in New Caledonia, a French island territory off the coast of Australia. She signed a contract for a commitment of 2 years and moved there without knowing anyone. I've told Owen that I think his mom, who is in her late 40s, is very brave for doing that, and Owen said, "That's just how she is." It turns out that she did not like living there very much and has instead found a new job in Congo that will begin once her current contract is up. Since his mom has begun to travel so much, Owen's relationship with his dad, who still lives in France, has improved. He spent last summer living with him, which is something he hadn't done in many years. When I told him he was lucky to have so many adults, his mom, his dad, his uncle, his aunt, who care for him, and that he had a unique experience, he agreed, but he also remarked, "But sometimes I wish they were together." This is the cry of the heart of most children of divorce, and it is no different for an immigrant child like Owen. Although Owen was part of a middle-class upbringing in France, his experience while living in the U.S. has been a bit different. When he moved here, he spent the first 2 years living with his uncle, his mother's brother. His uncle drives a taxi for a living. At first, I thought his uncle did well enough to support himself and take good care of Owen, but it more recently became clear that they had been living in poverty. This fall, they were evicted from their home because the landlord increased the rent, but Owen's uncle refused to pay the difference between the old rent and the new rent. For a while, they were living out of hotels. Regarding this situation, Owen repeatedly told me, "Times are hard, miss." Eventually, Owen's aunt, whose exact relationship to his mother or father is unclear to me, took him in to live with her and her daughters. Owen's uncle is not allowed at his aunt's house for some reason, so over the last few months, Owen has grown less close to his uncle. Regardless of whether he lived with his uncle or his aunt, Owen says that he's pretty much had to take care of himself since he's been here. He said he had to do some chores back in France, but his mom would make sure he had time to just be a kid by putting him in vacation camps during breaks from school. Now he says he is almost fully responsible for himself. I asked him to give me an example, and he said, "My aunt will drive me to the laundromat, but I have to do my laundry." I spoke with Owen's uncle on the phone briefly. He said that his nephew is a good boy. He says that he had academic trouble when living in France, but he has been a good student since living here. His friend helped Owen to get a job at Culver's, which is a restaurant, which he has held part-time since last year. Interview results regarding academics. Following the interview, I have a better understanding of the contrast between Owen's educational experience here and in France. Owen feels strongly that it was harder to be successful in school in France than it is here. He says the teachers are nicer here. He said he doesn't always feel like a good student in France, but he feels like one now. He said he didn't think he was focused enough back then. He says that having one's cell phone out in class would have never been tolerated in France, but here he's surprised that the teachers are relaxed about phones. He also is surprised that people take out their phones and still have good grades. He doesn't think that this would lead to success with the French system. He says it is more easy to study in the American system, and then that in France, only people who are actually smart that can be successful. In America, even if you're not as good, you can still succeed if you actually listen and care. You might take longer, but you can do it. I really love that quote from Owen. His freshman year, Owen found the curriculum to be easy and he didn't have much homework. Sophomore year was more challenging, but he rose to the occasion and he had better grades even than first year. And now that it's his junior year, Owen says that he needs to push himself. He knows that ACT is coming and he feels compelled to do the homework to keep up most of the time. He says that everything about the U.S. is easier than France, though. He said, no, even getting into sports here is easier because they're through the school. The only thing he could think of that might be harder here than in France is that in France you have a break in the middle of the day. Or if your teacher's not here, you can just leave. But in high school, in U.S. high school, there's really never any break. You have a short break for lunch. There's no such thing as recess. They still get recess as high schoolers in France. They have an hour to eat and have recess at least, and they don't finish school until 5 o'clock. It took him some time to get used to the system here. Owen was a math student in my freshman year class 2 years ago. He strove to do well and he volunteered answers even before he was sure whether he had the English to describe them. When I observed him in his junior level math class this year, I was pleased to listen to his thoughtful contributions to his group. His English is so much more developed than it was 2 years ago, and his group mates always seem to take his ideas seriously. He did not volunteer and answer in front of the whole group in the period that I observed, but I could still see that he worked hard to understand the back and forth that went on in the group discussion. Interview results regarding culture. When I asked what shocked him when he first arrived, Owen responded, how big the school is. A gallon of milk is bigger here. Even in the market, it's bigger. He also commented on the variety of people he sees here. He says that he sees more gay or transgender people here than he ever did in France. I started to ask him about politics and what he notices on the news, and he said that racism is a much bigger deal here than it is in France. He said, in my small city in France, I used to be the only black person. Paris is more diverse, more from Algeria, Morocco. However, even though he was one of the only black people, he says that in France, racism was almost a non-issue. On the other hand, he pointed out that religious discrimination is a much bigger deal in France than it is here. Owen is a Muslim, and he says that most of the time people welcome each other in France, but lately there has been a difficulty in terms of the Muslims being accepted. Owen says that the everyday people he encounters here in America are friendlier. People say hi while walking here. People are courteous. He also observed that people ask a lot of questions here, even if they are strangers. The other day, it made him laugh that his Uber driver asked him what grade he was in. It baffled him because that type of transaction would never have occurred in France. They're strangers. Why would the Uber driver have any use for that information? My reaction and analysis to these portions of the interview had to do with a few different theories. So that I was reminded of the iceberg theory when I realized how much Owen takes care of himself. My observations of him would never have led me to believe that he was doing everything for himself, almost like an independent adult. He's cooking for himself. He's doing laundry for himself and things like that. He really just doesn't take much help from anybody. So it really surprises me how resilient he is and how well he handles his life here in America when it is a big socioeconomic shift in terms of his responsibilities. A really big takeaway for me was thinking about the growth mindset. So Owen's comment about anybody can be successful in America as long as they care and they listen and it might take them time. I think that's something that's really great because we try to instill that in our students that this is for you. This education thing is for you. This information is for you. These skills are for you. You can do this if you take the time to care. And so he really believes that, and he buys into this here. As opposed to in France, what he took away from that experience was that school and success were only for the most gifted, only those who got it easily, and everyone else was just stuck, just trying to climb and hang on, even though it wasn't natural to them. He didn't feel very supported there. Since he was sent here to live in America because he was having trouble in France, it really makes me happy that he sees a difference and he feels that he can achieve greater success here. Another thing this made me think of was implicit versus explicit culture. So it seems that I probed Owen for a long time to try to get me to tell him things, try to get him to tell me things that he didn't understand here, or things that took him a while to understand culturally, or ways that he made cultural faux pas when he was here. And he really couldn't think of very much. Everything he kept pointing out to me had to do with language and specific uses of words, but not to do with culture and behavior. So it seems like Owen has a really good grasp on the implicit culture of America. And some evidence of that is that he does really get along well with everyone who I've seen him interact with. He's super sociable and well-liked. He's joined a lot of sports, and at first he was quiet on those sports teams. But now, as a junior, he is one of the most well-known people on his swimming team, on his tennis team, on his water polo team. Everybody knows him and likes him, and he really feels like part of the group. He doesn't feel different than them in most ways. And the last thing that this made me think of was the phenomenon of uprooting by Igoa that describes the 6 stages that children go through when they immigrate. I've personally seen Owen go through these stages over the last 2.5 years. During stage 4, Owen began schooling and probably went through some culture shock. During stage 5, I watched him become familiar with American fashion trends and assimilate. And now he's in stage 6. And the transplant was successful. He has a healthy outlook on his life here and his identity as a French person who lives in America. To conclude, I am happy to say that Owen reports that nothing limits him here besides his language. He's getting more and more fluent in English, and he is confident that he can go to college here in the U.S. He says he wants to choose a college in a, quote, pretty city, and he's not sure what he wants to study yet. The only reason he considers going back to France for college is to be with his friends. But even while he misses his friends, he says that he doesn't regret coming here at all.